And welcome to the Radioactive Show, produced at the studios of 3CR Melbourne and heard nationally on the Community Radio Network.
It's been 10 years since the US and its allied forces rolled into Iraq and began a war that, in the eyes of those affected, is still not over. This week on the Radioactive Show, we focus on the ongoing legacy of the war in Iraq and Australia's role in it. We hear from Donna Mulhearn, an Australian journalist and activist who has been to Iraq 5 times since the beginning of the war, first as a human shield, and just recently to focus on the ongoing impacts of depleted uranium. We speak to Jenny Grounds from the Medical Association for the Prevention of War on the Iraq War Inquiry. We hear from Gerry Georgatos, the convener of the Human Rights Alliance and organiser with the Wheelchairs for Kids program. And we also hear interviews with medical practitioners and people on the ground in Iraq that were collected by filmmaker David Bradbury and Donna Mulhearn on their most recent visit to the region. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Jessie Boylan. We all know that the real reasons why America and then Australia joined the war in Iraq, perhaps you could give our listeners a little bit of a background to this.
The real reasons are probably now seen to be quite complex in some ways and in other ways quite straightforward.
This is Jenny Grounds.
There's evidence that the moment George Bush came in as president, he was wanting some excuse to finish his father's war in Iraq. And some of that, of course, was pressure to get control of the oil supply. So it was probably going to happen one way or another. And the 9/11 situation really just gave them an excuse, and before 24 hours was up, Donald Rumsfeld was saying, let's get Saddam Hussein on this. And the myths that he was involved in 9/11 and terrorism began to be perpetuated and were believed by a large percentage of American citizens.
This is George W. Bush, the President of the United States. At this moment, the regime of Saddam Hussein is being removed from power, and a long era of fear and cruelty is ending. American and coalition forces are now operating inside Baghdad, and we will not stop until Saddam's corrupt gang is gone. The government of Iraq and the future of your country will soon belong to you. The goals of our coalition are clear and limited. We will end a brutal regime whose aggression and weapons of mass destruction make it a unique threat to the world.
And so why did Australia join in? What was its interest?
We know that Australia, that our Prime Minister John Howard was actually there around the time of 9/11, and he immediately committed us to support George Bush in any war on terror that took place.
Mr. Speaker, the decisive victory of the American-led coalition reflects enormous credit on the strength and the determination of the leadership of President Bush, Mr. Speaker.
But not only that, even before 9/11, we in Australia, the military in Australia had been doing some sort of joint exercises with America on this very issue of invading Iraq in the Middle East. So we had always planned to be there. That's not us, that's our government in their very secret way. And that is terrifying to think that we were told that it was about weapons of mass destruction, but really there were people in high places who wanted it to happen.
We did not want this war, but in refusing to give up his weapons of mass destruction, Saddam gave us no choice but to act.
Well, back in 2003, I went to Iraq as part of the Human Shield movement. That was a group of foreigners from all over the world who gathered in Iraq while the 20 million people approximately were having demonstrations on the streets of many countries around the world.
Donna Mulhearn.
Those of us who were able to go to Baghdad went there. The aim of the Human Shield movement was to bring that message of peace to the Iraqis, to stand with them in solidarity, to bear witness to what would happen, but also to protect humanitarian sites from bombing was our goal by our presence there. Mm-hmm. This was based on the concept that it seemed okay for our governments and our media to talk about invading this place, Iraq, and bombing it, because when they talked about the people who lived there, well, they rarely mentioned them, but when they did, they implied that they weren't like us, that they were different, that this was the other. And so their lives were not quite given as much value as our lives. But we knew if one of our lives was taken, then as a white Westerner, then that would be a public relations disaster and people would question the war. It's quite a sad premise, but a realistic one. And so that's why I ended up in Baghdad. I was there for a good month before the war started, which was a real privilege because I got to see what Iraq was like. This was a country that we knew nothing about. And they only ever talked about Saddam Hussein as if he was the only one who lived there. And the place was defined by suffering and oppression. What I found was a very different place, a place full of life, of colour, of high culture, of sophistication, a cosmopolitan place, a place with people full of life and sense of humour. And I just couldn't believe we were about to go to bomb them. I challenged people about their stereotypes with students because I admit to them that I had a stereotype about Iraq before I left in 2003. I didn't know, what do you pack to go to Baghdad? I had no idea about the place. So this was my 5th visit to Iraq. Yep. And so on each visit, I've seen the place deteriorate further. I hardly thought that was possible back in 2003 and 2004. I lived in Baghdad for 6 months during that period, and that was one of the worst periods. That was when the Abu Ghraib torture photos were released. It had a very terrible impact on the community there, as you could imagine. I was also there during the attacks on the city of Fallujah in 2004 and was an eyewitness to that. And the situation with internally displaced people who used to have a home, who ended up camping on football grounds and in schools, living in squalor, many of them still not having a permanent home. So things were terrible then. When I returned with a few years break in between last year, I was quite shocked that the situation was basically the same, if not worse. Baghdad was crumbling, infrastructure is very worn down, still only 3 or 4 hours of electricity a day. And we're talking about a place where you've got 50 to 55 degree heat in summer. If you don't have a generator to keep your fridge going or to keep your fan on, people die in those temperatures. And that's what happens every year.
I think Australians really still can't really comprehend, and I know some who've been there can really see it. And we can read reports, but really we can't imagine what it's like to have our very healthcare facilities and water supplies deliberately targeted and destroyed.
You're listening to The Radioactive Show, produced in the studios of 3CR Melbourne and broadcast all around Australia on the Community Radio Network. On the show this week, we're focusing on the legacy of 10 years on since the beginning of the invasion in Iraq by US and its allied forces.
Today, Iraq is a place with immense physical challenges in terms of electricity, unclean water, and poor infrastructure. And that's just one part of the challenge. The other aspect of living in Iraq, of course, is the political violence, and that's the major challenge in Iraq today. It's a place where the violence is unpredictable and it's regular. It's not as bad as the years of the political violence from, say, 2006 to 9, where there was 2,000 to 3,000 people killed every month. That's a massive amount of people. Currently, it's around 200 to 300. Now, that's bad enough. That's more than the war in Afghanistan, and that's on some days worse than Syria. And yet, it's fallen off the radar. And these deaths, of which there's been about 150 just in the last 5 days, it barely makes it to the mainstream news in places like Australia. So this war has never ended. And I fear, and many other commentators do as well, that we are heading back to those dark years of 2006 to 2009, and the numbers are increasing dramatically.
Yep.
So what we have is an unstable government. We have political parties who have death squads, people vying for power using violence, a divided nation divided by the policies of the Coalition Provisional Authority, that was the occupiers back in 2003. But what I mean by that is the policy of de-Baathification, where basically half of the society was sacked from their positions. I'm talking about school teachers and civil servants, if they happen to have joined the Baath Party 30 years earlier because it was a requirement of their job, or never went to a meeting or anything. But these sort of policies that isolated a sector of the community, divided the community, gave people labels for the first time, such as Sunni or Shia or Christian, because Iraq never existed like this before with these labels. Put all this together, add in terrorist groups from foreign countries that have poured over the borders, such as a group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, fighters from Saudi, you've got the influence from Iran. The place is dysfunctional, and this plays out every day with violence on the streets throughout the country. One of the issues that I've taken up, which is one of the terrible legacies of the war, is the impact of the chemical weapons that were used. So we're talking about white phosphorus and also weapons containing uranium, depleted uranium. The legacy being an dramatic increase in childhood cancers, leukemia and birth deformities, playing out in 2 major cities where those weapons were used, in Basra in the south and Fallujah west of Baghdad. And so I've gone to those places and spent time there, collected the stories. And so my goal is to humanise this issue and give the victims names and faces and share those with audiences.
We know that the Allied countries used the depleted uranium ammunition.
Faris Jassim Al-Imara from the University of Basra.
They lifted more than 350 tons of depleted uranium weapon at that time, and their effect was extended not only, unfortunately, that most of these weapons were used on the southern part of Iraq and Basra.
Till now, they don't give any information. They say that they use these weapons.
This is Mr. Kajak Vartanian, a radiation specialist with the Basra Environmental Department.
But they don't give us the information that exactly when they used, in which targets, in which places. He will contaminate the air when he goes to the target. When he hit the target, he burned. After burn, he changed to the uranium oxide and disappears in the air and in the soil.
I was at that time a witness of that use of depleted uranium.
This is Dr. Jawad Al-Ali from the Basra Hospital.
Because I saw the A-10 plane shooting their rounds at the tanks of Iraqi army for 3 days, and then another 3 days at the western part of Basra.
Before 1991, we don't have such a disease in Iraq. But after the attack of the U.S. forces, it started to appear.
This is Maki Al-Tamimi from the children's organization called Al-Fafidam.
In Iraq in general, and especially in Basra, because they use all these weapons. This weapon that they use, it destroyed a lot of metals, destroyed a lot of tanks. So imagine what it will do with the human being in general.
When people see the baby's face, this is Bashir, this is baby safe, there's only one degree of separation between them and the baby. It's me.
Donna Mulhearn.
So I try to bring it closer, and I try to make that connection so that Australians might engage with their empathy for these little babies. I mean, that's a sacred thing. We're talking motherhood and babies. That's such a deep felt response that people have to that.
Yeah.
And I hope to engage that. And so I'm making a documentary about that, and also writing a book about the battles of Fallujah. Okay. And we'll just continue to try to get out there and tell these stories.
After 2006, 2007, we start noticing that there's something wrong.
This is Dr. Samira Al-Ani, a paediatrician at Fallujah Hospital.
There's something that may be cancer or birth defect. Something going on is not like the previous years, not like before that time, 2004 and before that. I am not chemist. I can't speak in details about behavior of uranium. But from my experience, I can tell you that we start noticing that problem from about early 2006 or late 2005. It means that there should be some incubation, what you call incubation period or something like that. And one day we received 12 new cases. I couldn't register every case. It is difficult for me to follow every case. I am just one.
I found the DNA damage in this area is almost double or triple to the normal person.
This is Professor Akil Al-Yassin, president of the University of Kufa.
Those people in this area, if you ask them about the percent of frequency of cancer, they will tell you we have got a large number of persons getting cancer. If you can ask the women who deliver a newborn baby, you can say there is a huge number of malformation occur between these two babies as well. Of course, there's some sort of material or chemicals or depleted uranium. Those people have been exposed. When you ask what happened there, they told you this area is poor area. Many of them were insurgent, fighting with the American at that time, and this is the only conclusion I could reach.
You're listening to The Radioactive Show, produced in the studios of 3CR Melbourne and broadcast all around Australia on the Community Radio Network. On the show this week, we're focusing on the legacy of 10 years on since the beginning of the invasion in Iraq by US and its allied forces.
Depleted uranium goes back to the early 1990s with the Gulf War.
This is Gerry Georgatos, the convener of the Human Rights Alliance and organiser with the Wheelchair for Kids program.
The first and second Gulf Wars, and the radioactivity in the Al-Mutana region and the Basra region, which are provinces near Kuwait, have high levels of depleted uranium, 30 sites identified at least, and especially by the Dutch forces that were there at the time, who also refused to go into these areas despite protestations by the United States of America that there aren't depleted uranium in the region. But as a result of the depleted uranium, this has led to a disproportionate number of babies with deformities, particularly in Basra and Al-Mutana. And that's also a result of the landmines, the civil strife, the bombs. There are at least 50,000 amputees in Iraq, men, women and children without wheelchairs. Industry has been decimated. There's no wheelchair factories, no wheelchair assembly factories either. And there are at least 9,000 children without wheelchairs, and for the last 7 years We've been trying to get the wheelchairs to them and have sent thousands of wheelchairs over, and we've just sent a load that just arrived before Christmas, 337 wheelchairs. I've been aware of the depleted uranium since the 1990s, but it came out pretty much to the fore around 06 and 07 when the Dutch forces that were there as part of the so-called coalition, the coalition of the willing, they refused to go into villages and towns where they had traced the depleted uranium, and that they had argued publicly that the levels were that high that the villages and the townsfolk should leave. That the reality was none of them left because they had nowhere to go. So it's on the public record. It's just not an official status position of the United States to admit to the depleted uranium. But the depleted uranium is a reality, and it's a reality that's felt by the children who have been born with the abnormalities. And it's indicative that it has happened because the proportion of children being born with abnormalities that are radiation effect fallout depleted uranium have risen dramatically, and the regions of Basra and Al-Mutana are now the highest in the world in terms of proportion of population for children born with abnormalities that could be attributed to radiation fallout and depleted uranium.
And what do you think Australia's role is in the war in Iraq and the use of depleted uranium, if there is any?
Australia had no formal part in the depleted uranium, but they're fully aware, the Australian Defence Forces, the Australian government. It would be naive to say that they aren't aware. They're all party to it in terms of being complicit in terms of knowledge, but they've had no part in leaving depleted uranium. It goes back to the First and Second Gulf Wars. But Australia's role in terms of Iraq, well, they went there. They shouldn't have gone there. There was no reason to go to Iraq, and the WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, all of that a lot of us knew at the time weren't true, were proven not to be true, as, Mr. Wilkie himself, now an Australian, parliamentarian, was part of the Australian Defence Forces and resigned from the intelligence unit, said that there were no weapons of mass destruction. So Australians had no reason to go to Iraq. They went there as part of an invasionary force. And as others that I work with in Iraq, like Riyad al-Hakimi, who was a student here in Australia, studied international relations when I first met him, and came here as a refugee in the early 90s and has gone back and works with government in Iraq now to help his people. And he's the conduit in Iraq that I have to send the wheelchairs to children there. As he said, the whole country has been decimated, people disenfranchised, disempowered, and scratching just to survive because of what happened by the invasionary forces into Iraq, which has left the country in a worse condition, anything totally unimaginable, even when compared to the time under Saddam Hussein. I think, as with any war, if we take Vietnam, 1 million Viet Cong died in Vietnam for a war that no one should have got involved in, and that 1 million Viet Cong died as a result of that. If we look at all the statistics of, from all the different body counts from the different organisations, there's 1 million people that have died as a result of the conflict in Iraq, and the lowest stats, even if we take them from the Iraqi war logs or from the Iraq body count or from Associated Press, they're no less than 200,000 deaths. But they're closer to 1 million deaths, as time will prove. And the Lancet surveys of the Iraq war casualties have 601,000 violent deaths as a result, directly because of the war. That's the real legacy, and that's the legacy we've all got to deal with. Australians are becoming much more conscious that it was a war that they should not have participated in and that they were duped into. And more Australians are realising that, and what they're realising is the damage and the devastation that's been done to the country, and more will get involved, as have some who have got involved, like myself, in trying to make a difference to those that we have hurt in that country because of the manner of this war and of our direct involvement in this war. But it'll be generations that'll pass before we can even get them up to anywhere near where they were before the conflict actually arose from the decimation. But I think Australians have begun to realise, but are still complicitly silent, that it was a war that never should have happened.
I think there's a shocking silence, an appalling silence over the effects that this has had on the country. We'll hear about it for a few days around now, and I'm determined that we keep it alive just because it's such an important thing not to do again. It's so important we don't make the mistake of going along with our allies in such a dreadful misadventure in a foreign country.
Do you think the Australian government has learned that lesson?
I'm afraid that it's very difficult for them politically to admit any kind of fault and to accept our call for an inquiry into how we got involved, which is a very strong call from a number of sectors, particularly the Iraq War Inquiry campaign, which I'm involved with and Paul Barrett chairs. There's a lot of support for it, and I really hope that we can get the government to listen to that call and realise that unless we look into those mistakes and see what went wrong, we won't have a better process for deciding when we get involved in war.
You've been listening to The Radioactive Show, and that was Dr. Jenny Grounds from the Medical Association for the Prevention of War. Before that was Gerry Georgatos, the convener of the Human Rights Alliance and coordinator with the Wheelchair for Kids program. You've also heard on this program Donna Mulhearn, an activist and journalist who's just returned from a 5th trip to Iraq to witness the human environmental impact of the war and also make a documentary about depleted uranium. And a special thanks to David Bradbury and Donna Mulhearn for their recordings of interviews with people about depleted uranium in Iraq. Well, that's all we've got time for on The Radioactive Show today. Thanks for listening. And if you want to get in contact with us about anything presented on this show, send us an email at radioactiveshow.3cr@gmail.com. That's radioactiveshow.3, the number, cr@gmail.com. Or find us on Facebook. We are The Radioactive Show.